I think we'll start. I'm Jonathan Loy, the chair of the Department of Political Science, and I want to welcome everyone here to the first speaker in our fall speaker series. We're very happy to have Jen Steffek with us. He is in Canada as a visiting fellow at the University of Montreal, I believe, for a few weeks, and he's decided to come over to Ottawa to give this talk today. So thanks for coming to Ottawa today. I have a bit of a biography of our speaker, which I'll just briefly read, and undoubtedly mispronounce several German words, which I apologize. But Jen Steffek is professor, and I believe chair of the Political Science Department at the Technische Universität Darmstadt, and principal investigator in the Cluster of Excellence in the Formation of Normative Orders, hosted by Goethe Universität, Frankfurt am Main. He studied political science, sociology, and geography at the University of Munich. In 2002, obtained a doctorate from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. You can read much more about his bio and everything online and things, but he's here today, of course, to give us a talk on reconsidering the output-legitimacy of international governance. We're very happy to have you here today, and please take it away.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to Ottawa. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming to this talk. I shall talk, I think, about like 40 minutes, is that right? And let me just ask you, just before I start, because I'm curious to know sort of the background of the people in here. Is there anyone who's not from, let's say, international relations, European studies? So, in other fields? Or political science? Okay, so just because we have a lot of jargon just that we use in the discipline of IR and partly also in European studies, so I just would like to know a little bit what background people have in the audience. Okay, so let us get started. What am I doing today? What I try to do today is I want to scrutinize the relationship between the input and the output legitimacy of governance. I'll explain what these two terms mean. And I want to do this in the context of public international organizations, but a lot of things I will say will equally apply to the European Union, at least as I see it. And what I want to do in particular is to reject, first of all, this widespread view that the conception of output legitimacy is kind of unrelated to democracy, or just the opposition of democracy. Because if you read the current literature on international affairs, you very often find this juxtaposition in a way, that there is output legitimacy of governance that is something that's not related to a democracy, and there's the input side, which is all about democracy in a way. So I want to challenge this kind of opposition, and I will go back in history a little bit to the original conception by Fritz Scharpf, of course, who coined these terms, and I want to go into a bit deeper here into the relation between these terms and the idea of democracy. So what then am I saying about IOs? I will go on to argue that international organizations, which I like to conceptualize here as rather technocratic bodies, can function as checks and balances on state power and, so to speak, tackle the democratic externalities, I'm going to explain what I mean by this, of governance that is territorially bounded, of national government, right? And what I argue then is that the output legitimacy of these organizations rests precisely in the function to check the state power and also some epistemic aspects that I will come to in a minute. While I think that they can avail of something like democratic output legitimacy, I would then argue, however, that still this type of legitimacy needs to be connected to the input dimension as well. And I argue that there is an epistemic reason for this. And I will argue that IOs work on the basis, like other technocratic bodies do, on the basis of assumed citizen interests rather than articulated citizen interests. And these two, I argue, need to be confronted in a systematic fashion. So that's why I think still even international organizations will need both. Okay, let me briefly explain this notion of input and output legitimacy. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these terms, but let me just give you a short summary of the history of that concept. Now, it was elaborated by German political scientist Fritz Scharpf back in the 1970s already to in the beginning classify theories of democracy. That was the original intention behind this distinction, right? So this all goes back to Sharp's inaugural lecture held in 1969 at the University of Constance, where he gave an overview of then contemporary political theory and tried to classify several strands of it. And he used this idea of input and output legitimacy to classify theories of democracy, arguing that input and output are two perspectives on democracy that a scholar can adopt and have adopted also scholars in the past. Now, input type theories of democracy focus on mechanisms of citizen participation, representation. So the idea that citizens' preferences, citizens' interests are channeled into the political system via these input mechanisms, right? So that's the idea. That all is based, by the way, on Easton, right? So the whole idea of this political system and process, and also the terminology of input and output, which he takes from David Easton's system theory. But they have different connotations there, to which I'll come in a minute. But that's the idea, right? Input channels into this system, whereas output is what the system in the end is producing. And Sharp argues that there is another perspective taken by democratic theorists on these outputs and the specific qualities that these outputs have. And he will argue that both types of mechanisms, in a way, are essential for a democratic political system to function properly, but only that theorists have placed their emphasis in a way differently. So some have studied exclusively, or in the first place, these input or output-oriented mechanisms, but both are, in a way, in his view, necessary. But of course, what this implies is that output legitimacy is a sort of component of democratic legitimacy, which is kind of the wider term, rather than any alternative to democratic legitimacy, right? So this is still very much prominent in his his original conception. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Fritz Scharf may know that by now it is not that clear anymore. I mean, Scharf still emphasizes that there is a link between output and democracy in a way, but he now also has, in my view, himself come closer to the dominant interpretation of his work, and saying that output legitimacy is about efficient or effective, use both terms, problem solving. So, and that of course implies that indeed this can be unrelated to democracy. It's just what the system delivers in the end, right? So that's why I'm going back to his original distinction, because there it is much clearer, to my mind, than it is today. I think he's kind of mixing it up at times himself. Now, what types of democratic theorizing is he actually classifying now as output-oriented? And he discusses several things, but the two most important kind of bodies of literature are those on systems of checks and balances, kind of preventing abuses of power and privilege, right? So all these Republican theories on the political system and on how to balance the different power centers in there. And the literature on what today we would call deliberation, right? So processes in which decisions are made in a discursive way according to standards of, well, with Habermas one would probably say, communicative rationality, right? So he says these two types of democratic theorizing are output-oriented, right? And it is clear that if this is kind of the conception, both types of mechanisms in here have a certain affinity with non-majoritarianism, right? For example, functional agencies. This is what I want to emphasize today. Functional agencies to which the state delegates certain tasks, technical tasks normally, of course derive their legitimacy from especially the second point here, right? So institutionalized deliberation, having the people who know, having experts talk about good solutions to apparently technical problems. So that's kind of the way I now also want to classify international organizations, which of course also have delegated powers in that way. Technocratic agencies normally have relatively narrow mandates, right? So it is normally quite circumscribed what they are allowed to do. This is of course also true for most international organizations. I mean, most international organizations have a clearly circumscribed mandate in one policy field. There's only very few international organizations, the big ones of course, like the United Nations or the European Union, that really have very broad mandates, kind of tackling all sorts of things. If we look especially at these smaller international organizations, we see that they have a strong bureaucratic character, and that they have experts in very important positions in their decision making and in their policy making. In their policy making process. I think the best example maybe for this type of institution then would be independent central banks. Right? So that's an institution that has become popular in many Western political systems, but also at the international level, as you can see in Europe with the independent European Central Bank. So central banks are institutions that can legitimate their activities, of course, especially by the expertise they have and the independence from all the political pushing and shoving going on, with the claim that they will find the best, in this case, interest rate for a country or for a transnational economic area, currency area as we have it in Europe. So that would be kind of the prime example of this type of organization that I have in mind here. Of course, when you look at it, IOs are still a little bit different from national technocratic bodies to this extent that they always provide also some space for political negotiation. So it's not pure democracy in a way, but we always have an intergovernmental layer somewhere in these organizations as well. And there, according to this distinction, we may actually distinguish two types of international organizations. The functional organizations, in which this bureaucratic element dominates, and there are forum organizations where one could say the political element really dominates. And of course, the majority of IOs that exist today belong to the first functional type. And there are also some, like I would say, complex hybrids. Right? The European Union, of course, is always a very special case that managed to combine strong political elements, like the Council and the Parliament, with strong bureaucracies. In the EU, of course, that is the Commission. And as I said, my concern here is especially with IOs of the functional type or with these technocratic elements in complex institutional environments, in this case, the European Commission. Now, if we now relate this back to what we have said about output legitimacy, we can go a bit deeper into the basis of the legitimacy of these institutions. And my point here is, I think, that the input deficit of these international organizations was, first of all, historically planned. So if we look back to all these books written about international organizations between roughly 1900 and 1945, a period when many of the international organizations that exist today were founded. If we look back into this period, we see that these organizations were conceived as a means of depoliticization. So it was the precise purpose of having IOs to depoliticize international relations. So that was their sort of stated purpose. And I would argue that the democratic deficit that is often denounced today, rightly so, was of course planned. Not as a democratic deficit in the first place, but as a politics deficit. So The plan was to etch the politics out of international relations by handing over these tasks to this type of body. I mean, that was a clear-cut strategy. And that went on also after Second World War. If you look in Europe, for example, the European Steel Community, with this very, very strong high authority they had, a bureaucratic body. And it was clearly the case that they tried to etch politics out here. And it's true also for many other organizations of the UN system. So in a way, the democratic deficit, I would argue, was actually planned. And if we adopt such a perspective, we can also see how this was justified, right? As having IOs as checks and balance on state power, holding states to account for their behavior, both in their foreign affairs, but, and that is of course now a relatively recent development, increasingly also for what they do domestically. So becoming more intrusive international organizations. Now, why this may be regarded as an advantage from the democratic theory point of view is, in my view, that they can tackle the democratic externalities that the territorial fragmentation of the world brings about. Now, what do I mean by democratic externalities? So the idea is democracy, if it takes place in a bounded space, a nation, produces effects for others, right? So if we, especially in industrialized countries that dominate the world in many respects, take certain decisions, these decisions inevitably have effects that are felt in other parts of the world without asking the people there if they agree or not. So if countries such as the US or Canada decide not to care about climate change politically, not to do anything against it, just to pick an example, there might be citizens from other parts of the world come and holding them to account and say, well, this will have effects on our life as well. So according to the all-affected principle, we should have some say in this decision. So why are we excluded? And of course, transferring decisions to international organizations where states are held to account for their behavior is a way of creating, maybe not a perfect, maybe even a clumsy system of global democracy in that specific sense, right? So that we create a forum in which the global affairs in a way can be discussed and everyone has a voice. So for that reason, I think one can argue that having IOs as such is already an advantage in democratic theory terms. So holding states to account and balancing their power, having them answer to questions that others not living on the territory may have. Now there's a second dimension to it. If we follow Fritz Scharpf and his ideas further of output legitimacy, then this is the epistemic dimension, of course. IOs are not only populated by experts, but to a good deal, and depending a bit on the character of the international organization. And they are also drawing on expertise from the outside very often. Again, we take climate change as an example. There's now an intergovernmental panel on climate change, which is a weird construction. It's intergovernmental, still an expert panel, but okay. Is a body that is there to collect expertise from all over the world, bringing expertise together. And of course, the idea is, why should we have this type of organization? Because compromises just resulting from intergovernmental negotiations are unlikely to achieve here the same result, due not least to the reflection of relative power positions in the bargaining process. Right? So the idea is that in a good and functioning international organization, one would have, and this is certainly an idealization, but it's just a legitimatory strategy, of course, one would have a style of communication that will bring about good solutions in a way that are taking into account all the available information, all the best expertise, and so on. So it's not just the result of a bargain, but kind of a recent consensus. I mean, that's there in the ideal world, of course. But therefore then, IOs can claim, I think, to function as guardian of something like the transnational public interest. I mean, if you're familiar with European studies, I mean, that's precisely the role description of the European Commission, right? The guardian of the community interest. So you have one institution, the bureaucratic institution in the end, that kind of takes this holistic view, right? And the idea is that the individual states, of course, have their particular interests. They then try to balance through the negotiations that are going on in the council and so on. So transnational public interest here is safeguarded by these technocratic bodies. And I hope I have shown so far also that this balancing function and the epistemic function are in a way related. And I think the relationship between the two is in that we want to make sure that it is not just partial interests, power considerations, institutional politics that are determining the outcomes, but rather that the outcomes are just informed by considerations that are pertinent to the issue at stake. So that's why I think there is also a connection between these two aspects, shielding IOs from the member state influence and having competent personnel in there. Of course, as a note of warning here, I mean, what I'm outlining are potentials, right? These are potentials, and of course, these organizations would, in their self-legitimation and their justificatory discourse, of course, draw on them. But of course, that does not imply that in institutional reality that's always the case, right? But there are many pathologies that international organizations have. So I'm really interested here in how one may justify having international organizations and how it is done in practice. But it is not about, it's not anything like an accurate description of what's going on. Right? So ideal type, in a way. Now, the problem, of course, now if we are founding these international technocracies, and we have seen that the democratic deficit is kind of planned in there from the very beginning, so it's nothing that just was kind of an accident along the way. Right? So it's something that is part of the design. How can we reconcile this with the notion, the more complex notion of democracy that we have, that somehow requires also an input dimension? Now, let us have a look at the national democratic system. How is it done there? I mean, nationally, that's fairly easy. I mean, normally, technocratic bodies are kept in check by Parliament, right? So they have a mandate, and Parliament has the prerogative also to dissolve these bodies if they want, if they don't function well. So it hardly ever happens, but there is the threat also in the background. So they are still the masters in a way. A bit more difficult with international organizations, but still, that's how it works in the national system. Now, if we look to international organizations, the picture is a bit more complicated. I mean, first of all, internationalization, and that's kind of common sense, has weakened national parliaments when compared to the executive, right? Because normally, national parliaments are not very strong in foreign policy. National parliaments do not really follow what's happening internationally. For example, the US Congress was the only parliament in the world that scrutinized the Marrakesh Agreement setting up the WTO before ratifying it. The only parliament of the major parliaments. I mean, there's a study on that. It looked into the national discourses. The countries just didn't care. The parliaments didn't care. They accepted it. It was kind of, and it's in a way also understandable to the extent, especially if you're not the United States, but a minor country in the international system. If your executive comes to you as a parliament and says, well, by the way, that's the best deal we got internationally, so please ratify it. It's very hard for Parliament to open up this negotiation process again and say, oh no, please go back after 10 years of negotiation and say, hey, no, it doesn't work that way. We need an amendment. And that's, of course, one of the key problems of international politics. I mean, these negotiated compromises are very hard to revise then for national parliaments. So we have a problem here, especially for the parliament, but of course, especially for the minor states in the system also, for the executive. I mean, the power to reopen this kind of negotiation is very, very, the chance that it happens is very, very small. So you can stall the negotiation process forever, and that's what's happening, for example, in the Doha round. It's been going on for 11 years and nothing happens. So, and it's still not anywhere near to any conclusion. So you can stall the process for a while, but once the the deal is done and it's very hard to open it again. Now, another problem here is with the international executive, because of course in practice it's not normally the parliament that really supervises on a day-to-day basis what the executive agency or technocratic agencies are doing, but it's rather a ministry, it's rather specialized stuff in the executive looking into what's going on a daily basis. But again here, the executive, if you want to have imagine something like an international executive made up of this round of member state representatives, is relatively weak. And that doesn't have any ministries or something of its own, right? So it only has some national specialists. And still, if the executive wants to get acting against the technocracy, it needs to bargain before, internally, right? You have to mobilize something like the majority of member countries if you want to crack down on your own technocratic apparatus. So this kind of collective nature of the executive at the international level, of course, makes it also harder to control, in a way, the technocracy that's in there. So, and what's also clear is that for individual members of that collective executive, it is relatively hard to claim that they're defending like the common good of the transnational constituent or the public interest. Common good is just the translation of the German Gemeinwohl, but I understand it's not so common in the Anglo-Saxon world as a term. Technocratic bodies then will, of course, always level this against these individual members of the executive, saying, well, but this high view on the common good that resides here with us. So, unlike in the national setting, and that makes also these technocracies stronger, it has to do with the balancing function, is that the technocracy also has the function of monitoring the conduct of the member states. So if you think about it, something that's very popular in international relations is principal-agent theory, I think, right? Something adopted from management theory. So it's the idea there's a principal, the member states, supervising the agent, delegating tasks to the agent, and then trying to make sure that the agent is doing what the agent should do. But that's, of course, not an accurate description in my view, if you take just the member states as a principle here, because, of course, one of the key functions of these international bodies and technocracies is to supervise what the member states are doing. So the member states are accountable to their agent in a way, which one can kind of model, but I think it is relatively odd in terms of the original idea of a principal-agent relationship or about. So that's another special aspect. We don't really have that nationally, right? Normally, that these technocratic bodies are at the same time supervising what Parliament is doing, for example, right? So that's kind of an unusual constellation. So a very special constellation that leads to something that Martin Shapiro, an American public lawyer, has described very well, I think. And he says, I don't know if you can read it, in a transnational setting, however, attempts at political intervention in technical regulatory decisions largely will be attempts by politicians representing particular nation states. They will be seen not as democratic interventions against technocracy, but as national interventions intended to gain national advantage at the expense of other members of the transnational regime. Therefore, in a transnational regulatory regime, politics and politicians tend to be identified with bad national self-interest and international technicians with the common good. So that's kind of the strange constellation, in a way, once you have delegated policy making to international organizations. That is harder for democratically elected national representatives to claim that they are acting in the public interest here, right? Not in the transnational public interest, but rather that they are seen as being defending something like private interests, right? If you take the global community as a whole. Okay, so where do we go from here? I mean, one thing that I think is relatively clear is that all the remedies you want to come up with to strengthen the input mechanisms of international governance need to be something I would call cosmopolitan remedies. I don't think that it makes much sense to strengthen a proposal very popular in Europe, to strengthen, for example, national parliaments, the role of national parliaments in European politics. I don't think it's a good idea. Because you always end up here, right? So kind of German parliament versus Greek parliamentarians, Portuguese parliamentarians whatsoever, trying to push their case in Europe. So that, I think, is not a good idea. I would, and I will, if there's time, go to it. Come to it a little bit later. I would favor definitely cosmopolitan remedies here. So why do we need these remedies now in the first place? And very often the argument is made in democratic theory that framing this in terms of power relations, right? So the citizen's power position versus the power of technocrats, something like that. So it's very often in this couched in this type of terminology. I'm suggesting a slightly different framing of the problem here, by saying that, well, what actually is the problem with technocratic bodies? I mean, the problem with technocratic bodies in the end is they want only our best if they work well. But we are not sure that we want that as well, right? So technocratic bodies are operating on what I would call assumed interests of citizens, right? So how do experts work? I mean, central bankers would think, okay, according to all the indicators we have and according to all the macroeconomic theories that we're having, the interest rate of X would be appropriate in this situation and in the long-term interest of everyone, because we're all interested in economic stability and prosperity, right? So assuming that there is something like common, rational, assumable citizen interest in long-term economic stability and prosperity, we therefore take this decision, right? Because we believe that's in the best interest. And so it works, I think, with very many technocratic bodies, that the expert people working in there, on the basis of assumed interest of what should be in the best interest of individuals, then come to certain decisions. And of course, we are disenchanted with technocracy. So we are not in the age of Max Weber. So I thought that this was when many people, not Weber himself, but many people in that age thought that there could be a future where we would just be administrating the world without having any politics anymore in there. So that is, we are disenchanted by now. And we think that somehow we need to check back, and technocracies need to check back with the people affected, whether this is really what they want, or is this really in the citizen interest. So we have to set up, for, I would say, epistemic reasons rather than anything else, mechanisms that will make citizens and these technocratic bodies communicate, right, to balance their viewpoints, to align their viewpoints. So thought experiments of highly qualified persons are certainly not enough. And this is kind of the technocratic paternalism, one could call it, right? It's a form of paternalism that we fear. I mean, that's why we are fearful also of technocracies, the paternalistic tendencies that they have. Now, how could that then work in practice if this is what we want to achieve? As I said already, I'm a cosmopolitan, so I think measures of that kind need to be cosmopolitan in outlook. Because anything that strengthens, again, states, including their national parliaments, in international politics, of course, raises that conundrum that, as we have seen in the beginning, the good thing about international organizations is being a counterweight to individual states' interests. Right? And if we strengthen states, then we are opening up the way to other types of power politics, and that the stronger states in the end will get their way. And we're undermining this functioning of IOs as checks and balances on member states. So, in my view, that is not the way forward, but rather we need to find arrangements by which these international organizations are set into communication directly with citizens or citizen organizations. So how could that be done? And now we're coming to my final point here. Given that, I think, for the moment at least, global elections, global parliaments are too utopian a proposal as for being something that has some political cloud. I think there's maybe a long-term goal that we should pursue, but probably it's nothing that we should really work on at the moment. Now, what could the other cosmopolitan remedies falling short of a world parliament be? Now, what we can see, and there are of course a lot of smart people out there having already come up with a lot of ideas of how this could be done. I think there can be two types of settings in which such input may take place. I mean, on the one hand side, it could be what I would call micro settings, right? So where you have citizens or civil society organizations interact directly with each other and with members of the technocracy. So you could have advisory bodies in which you gather people. Of course, these micro bodies have a certain problem because they're inevitably kind of elite sort of governments. I mean, it's not that they can reach out to ordinary citizens. I think that's out of the question. Due to the specialized nature of international organizations and the high degree of professionalization that kind of functioning in a global political environment really requires. So you can have that, but it comes at a price, and it's of course selectivity. I mean, this is not ordinary people in there. What others have suggested on here, for example, the name John Dryzek would come to mind, is that what we actually need is something like global public spheres, right? Decentered spheres, mediated through the internet, through direct communication, maybe also through more traditional sort of mass media, in which everyone in the end can somehow intervene. So I like the idea very much, public spheres. But on the other hand, I think it's still a very cloudy idea. I mean, and what is very, very uncertain after all is, and that's my main concern also with Dryzek, is this: how will that impact concretely on decision making in the international level? As decision makers can always claim, yeah, we have taken that into account. But I'm not quite sure to what extent we should rely on that. I think we will need it in the end. So if you want to have something like accountability, public accountability of international organizations, they need to justify their choices towards something like a global public. But of course, this global public is relatively hard to discern. I mean, where is it? Who is included? I mean, we have, again, problems of inclusion that are not negligible here. I mean, many parts of the world still do not have internet access and things. So the information may all be out there, but it certainly will not reach everyone due to many constraints. So that's the second avenue, in a way, that I see could be a way of having technocracies and citizens communicate, but certainly not a ready-made, easy solution. Okay, so we can certainly go into this in a bit more detail in discussion. Let me just conclude what I was kind of trying to say today. Any system of governance needs a mechanism to secure input as well as output legitimacy for democratic reasons. And there is something like democratic output legitimacy. I think that's the first major point I'm trying to make. Democratic output legitimacy, as I would say, has two components. One is acting as checks and balances on concentration of power, public power, private power. In the case of IOs, certainly in a vertical dimension, so adding to the division of powers that you have, separation of powers you have in the state, you have also now a vertical dimension of international bodies holding states to account. That's part of their function. And that requires a certain degree of autonomy if you want to have IOs doing that. I mean, if they want to be, they are supposed to be efficient and functional as checks and balances. They'd rather be autonomous. The other dimension of output legitimacy that we have talked about was an epistemic one, so making sure that good decisions are being made in international organizations. But we've also seen that as much as this idea might be tempting, it has there's a danger attached to it, and that is, of course, something like technocratic paternalism, so that the experts' work on the assumed citizen interests is becoming imperial, and that they remain completely detached from citizen views on these issues. And therefore, as a remedy, I tend to suggest what I'd call cosmopolitan mechanisms of input legitimation to confront these technocratic bodies with the articulated interests, not just the assumed interests of citizens. So that's my message today. You know, I'm looking forward to your comments and challenges and criticism, whatever you may have. Thank you.
Thank you.